I am Emily Bennett, 32 years old, standing inside my grandmother's mansion for our yearly family gathering, feeling completely out of place. Surrounded by relatives adorned in high end brands and extravagant watches, my simple blazer and understated jewelry stand out like a sore thumb. Quiet whispers filled with disdain and sideways looks continue despite us sharing the same lineage. For a decade, I endured their subtle insults about my financial hardships, all the while silently building my own empire. They have no idea what I am carrying in my briefcase today. Before I go on, I would love to hear where you are watching from. So please share your location in the comments, subscribe, and stay tuned to find out how I prove to my status obsessed family what genuine success truly means. My family, the Bennetts, have been a cornerstone of Boston real estate since the 1920s when my great grandfather transformed a modest inheritance into a growing empire during the economic boom after the war. By the time my grandmother Eleanor assumed control in the 1970s, the Bennett name was linked with exquisite properties all across New England. Unlike her brothers who chased showy displays and social prestige, Grandma Eleanor was a savvy businesswoman who believed that wealth should be discreet and intentional. My father, her youngest son, inherited this practical mindset. He fell in love with my mother, a kindergarten teacher with no family fortune, sparking quite a stir among the class-conscious Bennetts. Together, they chose a humble lifestyle in a small suburb, much to the dismay of the rest of the family. My father, who worked as an architect, designed houses with the intention that people would genuinely enjoy living in them, rather than simply using them as status symbols. Meanwhile, my mother continued her teaching career. They both taught me that money should be seen as a tool, not a reflection of one's character. When I was 15, they passed away in a car accident returning from a weekend trip, and my world shattered instantly. My grandmother Eleanor took me in, even as my aunts and uncles whispered that I would become the family's charity case. During those initial difficult months, I would often find Grandma in her study late at night, flipping through old photo albums or examining property portfolios. Emily, she would say, most of the family has forgotten the true meaning of wealth. They believe it means showing off, but real wealth is something unseen. It is security, opportunities, and the ability to create change. Over the 3 years I lived with her before college, she taught me more about finance, investment, and property evaluation than any class ever could. She showed me how to interpret market trends, recognize undervalued properties, and most importantly, how to practice patience. My cousins Brandon, Vanessa, Taylor, Jessica, and Blake had very different upbringings. When my grandfather died, Uncle Richard became the family patriarch and embraced conspicuous consumption. His children, as well as those of other aunts and uncles, were given sports cars on their 16th birthdays, took extravagant vacations during every school break, and only wore designer clothes. While I drove the second-hand Toyota my parents had left me, I worked several part-time jobs and invested every penny I could save. Grandma Eleanor passed away during my final year of college, leaving each grandchild a modest inheritance. My cousins used their shares for down payments on high-end condos, exotic vacations, or even more absurd things, like Blake buying a small yacht he barely ever uses. I took my grandmother's advice to heart. I lived simply in a tiny apartment, kept working, and carefully invested my inheritance in small, overlooked properties in neighborhoods on the rise. The family's annual gathering began as Grandma Eleanor's way to foster unity and shared goals. After her passing, Uncle Richard turned it into a contest of status and rivalry. Who had the most impressive portfolio update? Who owned the priciest assets? Or which cousin had the most remarkable career progression? Every year, I showed up in modest attire, shared my intentionally low-key updates, and tolerated their barely disguised pity. What none of them realized was that by my 28th birthday, my portfolio had expanded to include 12 residential properties and 3 small commercial buildings, all bought through anonymous LLCs under the guidance of Grandma's old attorney, Mr. Winters. Last year, I discovered that the vast apartment complex where Uncle Richard's daughter, Vanessa, my cousin Blake, and 3 other family members lived was the property I purchased had recently been listed for sale because the owner decided to retire and wanted a discreet transaction to avoid disturbing the tenants. With the help of a holding company structure that Mr. Winters assisted in setting up, I acquired the building for $28 million, dollars, investing nearly every penny of my available funds. I carried out subtle upgrades while remaining completely anonymous as the owner. I even increased the rent modestly, yet it stayed well below the market price. Now, as I was getting ready for this year's conference, I heard that Uncle Richard was thinking about proposing the sale of Grandma's mansion. That grand estate is the core of our family heritage and the last tangible link to her wisdom. The very mansion where I now found myself watching my relatives display their affluence, oblivious to the fact that the so-called poor relation they had ridiculed for years actually owned the roof over many of their heads. I arrived at Grandma's mansion on Friday afternoon in my 10-year-old Toyota, the same car I had driven since my college days. The circular driveway already shone with luxury cars. Brandon's new Maserati was parked prominently by the front steps. Aunt Catherine's Mercedes SUV, Uncle Richard's Bentley, and several other high-end vehicles that probably cost more than many people's homes surrounded me. I parked my Toyota between Blake's Range Rover and Vanessa's BMW, making my car seem like it had mistakenly entered the wrong neighborhood. Taking a steadying breath, I smoothed the front of my simple navy blazer from Banana Republic and checked my minimal makeup in the rearview mirror. The mansion looked exactly as it always had. 3 levels of refined brick Georgian design stood before me, with white pillars framing the doorway and immaculately tended gardens spreading over 4 acres. As I ascended the limestone steps, a familiar mix of comfort and unease washed over me. This place had once been my refuge after losing my parents, yet now it symbolized the growing distance between my decisions and those of my relatives. I had purposely arrived early, hoping to capture some tranquil memories before the entire family whirlwind arrived. Martha, the housekeeper who had faithfully served our family for more than 30 years, opened the door before I even had the chance to ring the bell. "Miss Emily," she exclaimed, pulling me into a cozy embrace scented with lemon polish and cinnamon. "So wonderful to see you. You resemble your grandmother more with each passing year." For the first time that day, I smiled sincerely. "Thank you, Martha. You remain the finest welcome this place offers." Lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, she added, "You might want to know Mr. Richard has been here since morning, rearranging the conference schedule and conferring with the family lawyer." This came as no surprise, but confirmed my doubts about selling the mansion. Martha assisted me in carrying my weekend bag to my old bedroom, the one I had inhabited during those crucial years with Grandma. Unlike the other guest rooms that had been redecorated several times, this one stayed mostly the same, with its pale blue walls and white trim. The room featured a furniture set and a window seat facing the rose garden that Grandma had treasured deeply. I gently touched the bookshelf still filled with my cherished favorites. Finance books sharing space with novels, and the notebook where Grandma had once taught me how to monitor stock trends. Nearby stood a small framed photograph of my parents and me at Cape Cod during the summer before they passed away. As I unpacked, a knock sounded at the door. It was my cousin Jessica, the only relative who had consistently shown me genuine kindness. She smiled warmly, leaning casually against the door frame. Unlike our other cousins, Jessica had carved out her own path as a pediatrician. Although she maintained the expected family standard of luxury, dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater likely worth more than my entire outfit, Her gaze held no hint of the usual criticism I often endured. I wanted to tell you before everyone arrives, Uncle Richard has some major plans this weekend. He intends to propose selling the mansion. Although I had suspected this, hearing it confirmed made my heart drop. But this place is our heritage. Grandma would never have wanted it to be sold. Jessica sighed as she settled next to me on the bed. I understand, but he is talking about unlocking the value of the property and updating the family assets. He already has most of the votes secured. The voting system of the Bennett family governance was yet another one of Uncle Richard's innovations after Grandma's passing, controlling key family decisions. Decisions were influenced by each person's share in the family estate, which meant Richard, as the most successful businessman, practically controlled the majority of choices. My modest declared assets gave me very little voting influence. Is that the reason we are convening for 3 days instead of the usual two? I asked. Jessica nodded and explained that Saturday would focus on property matters, Sunday on financial reports, and Monday would feature the crucial vote. He is inviting developers to showcase proposals for luxury condominiums where the mansion currently stands. My heart sank because this place was more than just a building. It represented the last tangible link to Grandma's wisdom and principles. The idea of tearing it down for upscale real estate struck me as almost a betrayal. I quietly said, I am going to oppose this. Jessica squeezed my hand. I understand and support you, but expect strong opposition. She checked her watch and added, Everyone is gathering for dinner in 20 minutes. Vanessa has already asked twice if the unfortunate cousin has arrived yet. I forced a smile so as not to disappoint her. After Jessica left, I took a moment to steady my thoughts. I had come to this meeting with a strategy, but now realized the risks were far greater. That evening's dinner was exactly as anticipated. Crystal glasses, fine china, and conversation carefully crafted to showcase everyone's latest successes. Uncle Richard presided at the head of the table, where Grandma used to sit, boasting about his newest development project that was completely sold out before construction was even complete. He swirled his drink as he spoke confidently. The scotch was 30 years old and so rare that they had to turn away potential buyers. Aunt Catherine added that her charity gala had brought in 100,000 more than the previous year, carefully mentioning that she had not come across Emily's name on any recent donor lists. My cousin Brandon, who had become an executive at Uncle Richard's company purely because of family ties, kept steering the conversation back to his new Maserati. He said the waiting list for the car was 9 months, but they sped it up for our family name. He then looked at me with a sly smile and asked what I was driving these days. Emily still has that old Toyota, I replied after taking a sip of water. It serves me just fine. Uncle Richard's wife, Patricia, clicked her tongue sympathetically and said, You know, dear, if you let Richard guide you in some real estate investments, you could afford to improve your lifestyle. I wanted to tell her that my investments were doing well without Richard's advice, but instead I smiled and said, I am happy with the choices I have made. The subtle criticisms continued throughout the dinner, with mentions of exclusive clubs I was not part of, comparisons of vacation homes I did not own, and discussions about private school options for Brandon's children that I could not afford if I had any. Despite all this, I kept hoping that once they knew the whole story, there could be a chance for true family connection. After dinner, I took a solitary walk across the grounds, finding my way to Grandma's rose garden, now bathed in gentle landscape lighting, standing there among her cherished blooms. With great care given to the flowers I had nurtured, I once again made up my mind to safeguard her legacy, both the physical estate and the principles she had instilled in me. No matter what unfolded during this weekend, I was determined to honor her memory, even if it meant finally exposing what I had been quietly developing for all these years. Saturday morning came with warm autumn sunlight pouring through the curtains of my childhood room. I dressed with intention, choosing black slacks and a modest blue blouse. Professional, yet understated. The primary family meeting would begin at 9 o'clock in the grand drawing room of TCA, a place where many generations of Bennetts had gathered to make decisions that shaped our family's wealth. The moment I stepped into the room, I sensed a change in the atmosphere. The familiar family portraits were missing, replaced by drawings of sleek modern condominiums. Uncle Richard stood at the front near a digital projector as my cousins and their spouses took their seats on the antique chairs arranged in a half circle. Several faces I did not recognize occupied the back row, likely the developers Jessica had mentioned earlier. Emily, good to see you here, Uncle Richard said as I slipped into a seat beside Jessica. We are about to start the conversation about family image and standards. I nodded politely, catching the subtle looks exchanged between some cousins. Richard then began his presentation, clicking through slides that displayed the Bennett Family Holdings logo embossed on increasingly opulent buildings. Currency is what drives our world, he declared, while walking in his Italian leather shoes that likely cost more than my monthly rent. The Bennett name provides access, but only if we uphold certain standards in how we present ourselves to others. His eyes stayed on me with a significant look for a moment before he moved on. After going over several development projects that were already underway, he reached a slide titled Family Residence Reassessment. My heart dropped as a stunning photograph of Grandma's mansion appeared on the screen. As you all know, this estate has belonged to our family for 4 generations. While it has emotional importance, it sits on 5 acres of prime land, currently estimated to be worth roughly $45 million. Aunt Vanessa, dressed elegantly in her designer outfit with hair perfectly highlighted, raised her manicured hand. Richard, before you go further, I believe we should recognize that some relatives are emotionally connected to the old house. She smiled at me, but the warmth did not reach her eyes. Emily, dear, I understand you lived here once, and we all respect that. But surely you realize that feelings cannot interfere with prudent financial choices. Before I could reply, my cousin Blake cut in. Speaking of smart financial moves, has anyone seen my new SL Roadster outside? Just picked it up yesterday, limited edition, only 20 in North America. The abrupt change of topic clearly aimed to highlight the divide between my financial position and his. Richard nodded with approval and said this is exactly the type of statement piece that strengthens our family's standing in the community. He then proceeded with his presentation, describing a strategy to sell the mansion, allocate the earnings among family shareholders based on their current stakes, and develop high-end condominiums on the grounds. The developers seated behind row began handing out glossy brochures depicting sleek glass and steel buildings, which hardly resembled the cozy brick house that had sheltered our family for generations. The expected return on investment is significant, Richard declared confidently. He paused to check for questions before moving to a preliminary vote. I raised my hand and Richard acknowledged me with barely hidden irritation. I said calmly, even though my heart was pounding, I believe we should honor Grandma Eleanor's wishes. She clearly wanted this house to be maintained as our family's meeting place and a historical symbol. She reminded me many times that not everything should be evaluated by its profit potential. Uncle Richard's smile tightened. While Eleanor possessed many admirable traits, the market has shifted greatly since her era. What made sense then does not necessarily apply now, Aunt Catherine whispered with a snicker. Besides, Emily, given your limited experience in luxury real estate, perhaps your opinion should carry less influence here. I stood firm. I have examined the property values and neighborhood developments carefully. The historical significance of this location actually adds to its value as a preserved site, instead of being torn down to make way for another upscale project that could end up half empty, like the Westbrook development did last year. The room briefly grew quiet before Brandon let out a short, scornful laugh. He said, "What would you understand about real estate? You cannot even afford a house of your own since you are still renting that small apartment downtown, aren't you?" Several cousins snickered, and I felt a flush rising to my face. I responded firmly, "My housing decisions are intentional, not restrictions." Brandon interrupted me again. "Sure they are, just like my choice to drive a $150,000 car instead of a decade-old Toyota is deliberate. Some of us can afford our decisions, cousin. Others only pretend their limits are choices." Richard cleared his throat, not to defend me, but to steer the conversation forward. "Let us take a preliminary vote about the idea of selling and redeveloping. We can talk about specific plans after lunch." The vote was exactly as Jessica had expected, with the vast majority in favor of selling. Only Jessica and I opposed it. As we moved to lunch, a heavy wave of disappointment settled over me. It was not only about losing the home, but realizing my family truly viewed me as nothing more than the poor relative, whose opinion carried no weight because her finances failed to impress them. During lunch, Jessica found me sitting in the garden on the stone bench where Grandma used to share stories about our family's past. "I'm sorry," she said as she sat down beside me. "They can be such snobs." I nodded, holding back tears. "It's not even about the money. They have never bothered to ask what I actually do with my life or why I make the choices I do. They just assume I am struggling and failing to keep up." Jessica gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "For what it is worth, I have always admired how you have forged your own path. There is something inspiring about not feeling the need to show off all the time." I smiled, grateful, but the morning's confrontation had cut deeper than I expected. For all these years, I told myself my family's opinion did not matter and that I was creating something meaningful, regardless of their approval. But their casual cruelty and dismissal continued to hurt in unexpected ways. As we walked back toward the house, Jessica lowered her voice. "Just so you know, tomorrow's session is going to be even worse. Everyone has to present their personal financial highlights for the year. Richard always arranges it to show who contributes most to the family's prestige." I nodded, already dreading the event. "Thanks for the heads up." That evening, during dinner, the conversation centered on which luxury amenities should be included in the new condominium complex that would take the place of our family home. I listened quietly as they debated the details. Between endless pools and private rooftop gardens, surrounded by marble or imported limestone finishes, I came to realize how profoundly our values had diverged. As I sat quietly reflecting on the widening gap between my family and me, I couldn't help but question if there would ever be a way to mend it, or if I even wished for reconciliation anymore. Sunday morning's discussion was all about inheritance issues and property assets, the core of our yearly family gathering. The drawing room had been transformed overnight, featuring a long mahogany table in place of the relaxed seating from the previous day. Uncle Richard took his place at the head, leather portfolios set before each person. Mine caught my eye, noticeably slimmer than the rest. "Today, we will examine both our personal and collective assets," Richard announced once everyone settled in. "As you know, our family's voting power depends on contributions to the total estate. I have prepared an updated breakdown," he said, gesturing to his assistant who handed out spreadsheets detailing each member's declared possessions and their proportional voting influence. As anticipated, Richard controlled 38% of the votes, with his children and siblings holding most of the remainder. My own voting weight was listed at a mere 2%, reflecting only the small legacy I had openly accepted from Grandma alongside my modest earnings as a financial consultant, the purposely ambiguous description of my occupation. Before we begin, during the individual presentations, Richard continued by suggesting some modifications to the way the estate was distributed according to Eleanor's will. This immediately caught my attention because Grandma's will had built in safeguards designed to stop any single family member from gaining excessive control. Now, Richard was proposing to simplify these safeguards, aiming for smoother administration. These changes would essentially transfer more influence to the richest family members, especially himself. As the relatives nodded in agreement, I carefully noted every proposed adjustment since these would be important topics to review with Mr. Winters later. Following the inheritance discussion, we shifted to financial updates from each family member. Brandon was the first to speak proudly about his new role as vice president at Uncle Richard's company. He mentioned the bonuses he had received and described his portfolio filled with luxury investments. Of course, he also bragged about a recent purchase, a vacation home in Aspen. He concluded his report with a smirk, saying, I closed on it last month. It has 4 bedrooms, ski in, ski out access, and a hot tub with breathtaking mountain views. After him, Blake talked up his investments in tech startups and mentioned upgrading his yacht since the previous one was too small to entertain properly. Vanessa then described how she had expanded her art collection and secured spots for her children at a private school famous for its 5-year waiting list, explaining that the Bennett name had made all the difference. One after another, my relatives proudly showcased their growing fortunes. Each presentation was met with approving nods and curious questions when Taylor mentioned the difficulties she faced in securing household staff for her 3 residences. Aunt Catherine quickly offered her contacts at the top agency for domestic help, explaining they only collaborate with select families but promised to recommend Taylor. The discussion soon shifted to the upscale apartment complex where several relatives resided, the very building I secretly owned. Vanessa remarked on the superior amenities but expressed dissatisfaction about changes in management. They have been renovating the lobby, causing a lot of noise and disruption, she said. Blake agreed enthusiastically, adding that the rent had increased during the last quarter, which annoyed them on principle. Brandon leaned in, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. What is odd is that nobody seems to know who owns the building now. It was bought by some holding company last year, very secretive, he shared. Uncle Richard thoughtfully tapped his pen against his portfolio and suggested using family connections to uncover the buyer. If it is an investment group, he proposed, maybe they can be convinced to sell it to us. The location is ideal, and having control would benefit all family members there. I kept an impartial face, though inside I was tense hearing them discuss casually how they might pressure the unknown owner, me, into selling despite my wishes. Brandon could exert some influence through the appropriate contacts, Richard went on. I know individuals at the city planning department who might grant approvals for upcoming renovations. Hearing them speak casually about leveraging their networks to intimidate a property owner made my blood boil. This was precisely the kind of entitled attitude grandmother had always condemned, using family clout not to build value, but to seize it from others. When my moment arrived late in the afternoon, I delivered a purposely modest overview of my consulting work and steady investment growth. As I talked, I noticed Brandon glancing at his phone, Vanessa whispering to her husband, and Uncle Richard tapping his pen impatiently. No one posed follow-up questions or appeared interested in my thoughtful financial plan until Aunt Catherine broke the silence to say, Dear, have you ever thought about changing careers? Surely there's a more significant pursuit you could follow with the Bennett name backing you. The disdain in her voice was clear before I could reply. Brandon interrupted with a sly smile. Maybe she just needs to find a good marriage. That's still a solid plan, right? The room erupted with barely hidden chuckles. I felt my face flush but maintained a calm demeanor. I'm quite content with my present direction, I answered calmly. Not everyone defines success by the same standards. Uncle Richard cleared his throat and said, Well, speaking of different, I believe we need to consider a special arrangement for family members who may require extra assistance, he said without looking me in the eye, but everyone understood whom he was referring to. The Bennett family has always looked after its own, and perhaps it is time to create a formal system for those who have not been as lucky in their financial pursuits. The shame of being regarded as a charity case was almost too much to bear. I sat stiffly in my seat, my hands tightly clasped beneath the table, while they debated how to help me without ever asking what I actually needed or wished for. Later that night, I retreated to my room and called Mr. Winters, my reliable lawyer and advisor. I explained the situation, outlining the proposed changes to Grandma's will and how they were considering examining the ownership of Vanessa's building. Mr. Winters chuckled quietly. I expected something like this, he said. Don't worry, your ownership setup is fully protected and anonymous. Several corporate layers keep your identity completely secure. I exhaled and gazed out the window at the garden bathed in moonlight. This has become more than just about hiding my investment now. They intend to sell Grandma's house, the very heart of her legacy, and the way they spoke about using family connections to pressure people into bending rules their way is exactly what she detested. Eleanor would be proud that you have upheld her true principles, Mr. Winters said softly. What do you want to do now? I paused for a long moment, watching a cloud drift across the moon, then said I believe it is time to prepare my complete portfolio documentation. Could you send over the full ownership records for all properties, including the apartment complex? He asked carefully. Once you disclose your assets, there is no turning back. I am certain, I answered with a newfound resolve replacing the pain I had felt earlier. They have underestimated me for the final time. Tomorrow I will reveal exactly who they have been overlooking all these years. Monday morning arrived with a feeling of unease as I got ready for the last day of our family conference. Today, each member would share their detailed financial statements and investment plans. This part of our annual meeting always highlighted the vast difference between my relatives' lavish wealth and my supposedly modest resources. I dressed more thoughtfully than usual, selecting a simple yet classy black dress I had bought on sale at Nordstrom the previous year, paired with my mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I ever wore to these occasions. By the time I arrived, the family had gathered in the library. The antique table was now covered with laptops, tablets, and expensive leather portfolios embossed with the Bennett family crest. Uncle Richard opened by emphasizing the need to uphold family standards and introduced a new aspect to our usual routine, a comparison chart detailing each family member's net worth. The value increase over the past 5 years was illustrated by the bar graph displayed on the projector screen, which highlighted his towering accomplishment in navy blue. Behind that were significant bars representing his children and siblings. My own input appeared as a barely perceptible sliver at the far right of the chart. As you can see, he remarked with a faint smile directed at me, some of us have successfully embraced the Bennett legacy of financial expertise more than others. Several relatives chuckled, and I noticed Brandon nudging Vanessa as they exchanged glances filled with barely concealed amusement. The individual presentations commenced with Uncle Richard, who described his growing commercial real estate empire, recent purchases in emerging markets, and ambitious plans for launching a luxury hotel chain. My cousins followed with similarly impressive reports. Brandon's executive compensation package, Vanessa's husband's hedge fund triumphs, and Blake's technology investments, which had apparently doubled in worth. Each presentation was met with thoughtful questions, appreciative murmurs, and suggestions for further expansion opportunities. When my turn finally arrived, the room's energy noticeably diminished. Several family members reached for their phones, while others started quiet side discussions. I began my rehearsed overview of modest consulting engagements and minor investments, sticking to the long-maintained script. Uncle Richard glanced at his watch. He kept insisting that this was just a mere formality, not deserving his full focus. Halfway through my presentation, Aunt Catherine suddenly interrupted with a deep sigh. Emily, my dear, I do not intend to be harsh, but it pains me to see you live so far beneath your true abilities year after year. The Bennett name should carry weight, yet you appear determined to barely get by. The room grew quiet as all eyes shifted toward me. I maintained a neutral expression. I would not describe my life as struggling. Aunt Catherine, I am quite content with the path I have chosen. Brandon let out a scoff. Content in that cramped apartment filled with secondhand furniture and a car that is over 10 years old? Let's be honest, you are the poor relation here, we all see it. Laughter spread across the room, less held back this time. Brandon grew more animated as he pressed on. Some of us are genuinely furthering the family legacy, but others are just skating by on the bare minimum our grandmother left them. His casual cruelty struck harder than I had expected. Despite years of their disdain, being openly ridiculed still stung painfully. Uncle Richard cleared his throat not to defend me, but to shift the conversation. Perhaps this is the right moment to talk about the family support program I mentioned yesterday. Emily, there is no shame in accepting assistance when necessary. We could arrange a monthly stipend to help you lead a lifestyle befitting our family name. The implication that I required their charity when I was worth more than several of them combined was the breaking point, yet I kept my calm. Years of mastering the art of concealing my true emotions served me well. That will not be necessary, Uncle Richard, but I appreciate your concern, I stated calmly while gathering my papers. If my presentation is complete, I will step outside to get some fresh air before lunch. Once the library door shut behind me, I hurried upstairs to my room, my hands shaking with a blend of anger and pain. Alone, I finally let my tears flow, not from money worries, but from the painful realization that my family had never truly seen me. They had built a story about who I was without ever trying to understand beyond their assumptions. I moved to the window seat where Grandma and I used to sit together, gazing out at the garden she adored so deeply. What would you do now? I murmured, hoping she might somehow respond. In the stillness of the room, surrounded by memories of the only family member who had genuinely valued me, I felt a change within myself. A growing determination began to replace the fresh wounds. This mansion, this heritage, belonged to me as much as to them, and I had honored it in ways they could never truly grasp. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted my reflection. Martha, the housekeeper, came in with a worried look. Miss Emily, I brought you some tea. I noticed you left the meeting rather fast. Her thoughtful act brought new tears to my eyes. Martha had been part of the family for decades, and unlike the relatives had always shown me sincere kindness. They still regard me as that orphaned girl who required charity, I said while gratefully taking the teacup. No matter what I achieve, I will forever be considered the less fortunate member of the family. Martha sat by my side, her aged hands smoothing her apron, a motion I remembered from my childhood as she gathered her thoughts. Your grandmother used to say that wealth causes some people to have very poor judgment. She spoke softly. They focus only on what glitters brightest right before them and fail to recognize true worth. She paused before adding, Miss Eleanor would be deeply proud of how you have upheld her values. She always insisted you were the one who truly grasped what the Bennett heritage signifies. Receiving this reassurance from someone who had known my grandmother closely brought unexpected solace. Thank you, Martha. That means more than you realize, I whispered. She gave my hand a gentle squeeze, then stood up. The package you were waiting for arrived while you attended your meeting. I placed it on your desk. My heart raced. Mr. Winters had sent the papers I had asked for. Thank you, I said once more with renewed determination. After Martha left, I carefully opened the parcel and laid out the documents over my bed: property titles, business ownership charts, portfolio appraisals, and most importantly, the proof confirming my possession of the exclusive apartment building where Vanessa Blake and three additional relatives resided together. As I traced my finger across the title deed, its official seal stirring a complex blend of triumph and sorrow. Tomorrow was the day I intended to disclose my actual financial standing. Yet after the day's humiliation, I doubted whether I even desired these individuals in my life any longer. Did I truly require the approval of family members who had only ever offered condescension and quiet cruelty? As I organized the papers, memories surged. Grandma patiently teaching me how to read financial reports at this very desk, explaining that genuine wealth was not about flaunting status, but about building safety and possibilities. The Bennett name once symbolized more than prestige. She had said it stood for honesty, vision, and responsibly wielding privilege. At that moment, observing the proof of how diligently I had followed her wisdom, I reached my conclusion. I would not unveil my achievements to gain their approval or admiration. Instead, I would do so to honor Grandma's authentic heritage and to affirm once and for all that I was not merely a minor character in the Bennett family saga. I was its future, regardless of whether they acknowledged it or not. The afternoon meeting commenced with fresh vigor as Uncle Richard redirected the conversation to tackle issues about the tenant relations in the upscale apartment complex where Vanessa Blake and several relatives lived. I could not ignore the irony as I settled into my chair. With documents safely stored in my portfolio, I listened to my family vent about the choices I had made regarding property management. Emily expressed frustration about the installation of the new security system, angrily brushing her perfectly styled hair aside. The contractors begin their work at 9 in the morning, 9 as if anyone deserves to hear construction sounds during breakfast time. Blake nodded emphatically and added, "They've introduced this unnecessary guest registration rule. I even had to register my housekeeper as a regular visitor. Don't they realize who we are?" Richard leaned forward, intertwining his fingers in the commanding gesture he had adopted since grandmother passed away. This is precisely why family control over key properties is vital. When ownership changes, new management fails to grasp the needs of prestigious tenants. I held back my reply as they went on, fully aware that these security measures were installed after a break-in took place 2 floors below Emily's apartment. The visitor policy was also a response to multiple reports from residents about unknown individuals entering shared spaces. In reality, my upgrades had boosted the building's worth by 12% over the last year, yet they focused only on minor annoyances. I asked Jenkins to examine the ownership structure. Richard continued, mentioning his personal lawyer. The building had been acquired by Horizon Holdings last year, which in turn is owned by Summit Investments, which it seems to be controlled by some offshore organization intentionally kept unclear, which implies they could be susceptible. Under the right kind of influence, the calculated manner in which he talked about using family ties to pressure others reminded me sharply. Still, I kept my composed exterior. Years of experience helped me stay steady. "What kind of influence?" I inquired. Innocently, Richard smiled without catching the sharp tone in my voice. "There are always approval procedures that can be sped up or slowed down, depending on relationships with key officials. Plus, with 5 Bennett family members as tenants, we represent a considerable share of their high-end units. A united effort could make continued ownership difficult for them." Brandon laughed and added that if we discovered code violations or tax discrepancies, our contacts at the city assessor's office might suddenly become highly interested in investigating their properties. I watched in shock as my family casually talked about using their power to bully a property owner into selling unwillingly. This was a perfect example of the privileged behavior Grandma always condemned. Emily, Brandon added with a smirk while looking at me, this is how real estate truly operates in the real world. Not that you'd grasp it since you can't even afford your own place and are still renting that small apartment downtown. The room fell quiet for a moment before uneasy laughter began. It was not only the mockery angered me deeply. It was the blatant corruption they accepted while pretending to honor the Bennett legacy. Speaking of real estate, Richard smoothly shifted the topic. Let's settle our decision about this property. He indicated the mansion. The developers made a very attractive proposal, and the expected profits from converting it into luxury condominiums would benefit all shareholders. I raised my hand, determined to make a final effort to save Grandma's home before voting. I suggested an alternative. This house holds historical significance beyond its market value. What if we transformed it into the Bennett Family Foundation headquarters? We could maintain the architecture while establishing something that celebrates Grandma's commitment to community investment. Richard's face showed he had already dismissed my proposal. Before I finished, while that idea is imaginative, the financial gains would be far less compared to development. We must be realistic about these assets. Aunt Catherine agreed. Moreover, a foundation demands significant ongoing oversight. Some of us, she looked pointedly at me, might have time for such initiatives, but those of us focused on expanding the family wealth have different priorities. The vote that came next was merely procedural, with Richard possessing almost 40% and his supporters another 45. My 2% and Jessica's 5 made no difference. The choice to sell Grandma's cherished property was sealed. Replacing the home with lavish condominiums was approved with overwhelming enthusiasm as Richard detailed the schedule for vacating the premises and starting the demolition. A peculiar sense of calm washed over me because this was no longer just about a house. It had become about the spirit of our family and the principles that were forsaken in the quest for status and outward extravagance. Later that night, I contacted Mr. Winters from the quiet of my room. They voted to put the mansion on the market, I explained, gazing at the garden where Grandma had taught me about patient investing and genuine worth. They intend to use family influence to pressure the unknown owner of Vanessa's building into selling. Mr. Winters chuckled lightly. They have no clue who they are dealing with, do they? Are you still planning to reveal yourself tomorrow? I watched the sunset cast golden and ruby hues over Grandma's roses and answered, yes, but first I need your assistance with something else. Could you prepare documents transferring my ownership of Bennett Capital Holdings to a new entity that would enable me to buy this property before they sell it to developers? There was a moment of silence before he replied. Eleanor always said, you were the one who truly grasped the meaning of legacy. I will have everything ready by morning. What name should the new entity carry? I smiled, recalling Grandma's favorite saying that wealth is a tool, not a trophy. Name it Eleanor's Legacy Trust. After ending the call, hours were spent examining every detail of my holdings, preparing for the announcement that would ultimately transform my bond with my family. The pain and frustration I had experienced earlier had solidified into a stronger force, a complete understanding of who I was and what I represented. Whether they embraced me or not was no longer important. I belonged to the Bennett family in the ways that genuinely mattered, and tomorrow they would finally grasp the significance of that fact. That evening, alone in my childhood room, I laid out my entire portfolio on the bed, arranging each piece carefully for the upcoming revelation. The full extent was impressive even to myself. There were property deeds, corporate ownership documents, investment accounts, and financial records revealing a net worth sure to astonish my image-conscious family. I owned 15 properties altogether, including 3 commercial buildings in rapidly growing districts, 12 residential homes in highly desirable areas, and naturally the luxury apartment complex where several relatives lived. My total assets surpassed $73 million, exceeding Brandon, Blake, and Vanessa combined. I placed everything inside a leather bound portfolio that I had bought just for this occasion, matching the stylish cases my cousins brought to family gatherings. It was ironic that this became the first time I had invested in appearances rather than substance. Yet tomorrow was about making a statement impossible for them to ignore. As I organized the papers, memories rushed in of Eleanor sitting. She sat with me right here in this very room, sharing her philosophy about patient wealth growth. The issue with flaunting your money, Emily had explained, is that you keep spending instead of building. Genuine wealth is not about showing off status. It is about creating safety and opening doors to new possibilities. I recall how she taught me to study patterns in neighborhood development to spot properties with the potential for long-term value increase, rather than those with just immediate prestige. While my cousins were purchasing luxury apartments in fully developed areas, I followed grandmother's advice and focused on undervalued neighborhoods on the verge of renewal. My initial investment was a modest duplex in a district other investors overlooked as temporary. I lived in one unit and rented out the other, using the rental income to cover the mortgage as property prices steadily rose. After 2 years, I sold it for almost twice what I paid, reinvesting the earnings into 2 more properties, maintaining the habit of simple living even as my investments grew. The apartment complex was my riskiest move, committing nearly all of my available funds into one asset. However, the location was unbeatable, and my research indicated promising value growth with only minor improvements needed. By using the LLC arrangements that Mr. Winters had helped me set up, I kept my ownership completely confidential while making the necessary upgrades. I increased both the value and tenant satisfaction, despite what my complaining cousins might think. I took out the original handwritten investment journal my grandmother had given me when I turned 18. The first entry in my teenage handwriting described the $500 I had invested in a mutual fund she had suggested. Page after page documented my progress, starting with small stock buys and advancing to more complex investment choices, all based on her principles of patience, thorough research, and valuing substance over flashiness. I traced my finger over her notes in the margins. Excellent analysis, Emily. Think about the 10-year potential, not just the 2-year return. These remarks had guided me when she was no longer here to counsel me personally. My phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Winters. All documents prepared as requested. Eleanor's Legacy Trust is set up and ready to move forward when you give the word. Tomorrow, I replied with gratitude, then went back to organizing my portfolio, ensuring every paper was arranged to make the strongest impression. This was not merely about showcasing my financial achievements. It was a way to honor Grandma's true heritage of careful management and quiet resilience. Around midnight, a gentle knock at my door startled me. Jessica appeared in the hallway, worry clear on her face. She said, "Just checking if you are all right. You were very quiet at dinner." I paused, then stepped aside to let her in. As she quickly looked over the documents spread on my bed, her eyes widened at the sight of property deeds and financial records. "Emily, what is going on?" I trusted Jessica more than anyone else in the family, but I had held on to my secret for too long to just reveal it casually now. "I am simply getting ready for tomorrow," I explained vaguely. She picked up a folder I had missed, the one with the documents proving my ownership of the luxury apartment complex where she, along with Vanessa and Blake, lived. Her jaw dropped as she read the title deed. "You are the mysterious owner they have been complaining about," she said. I nodded, a wave of relief washing over me at finally sharing my secret with someone who might understand. Please do not tell them yet. I am planning to reveal everything tomorrow. Jessica sank onto the window seat, shaking her head in disbelief. All these years, they treated you like the struggling poor relative, yet you were what? A hidden millionaire? I smiled at her surprise. I followed Grandma's advice about patient investing and living modestly. The less they noticed me, the more freely I could act without interference from the family. Jessica laughed quietly. Brandon is going to have a heart attack. He was just saying tonight that someone should explain basic real estate principles to you so you could at least afford a decent car. Her face then turned serious. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Once they find out, everything will change. They will either resent you or instantly become your best friends. Neither option sounds very appealing. I joined her on the window seat, gazing out over the garden bathed in moonlight. I do not need their approval. I no longer seek approval, but I must respect Grandma's true legacy, not the twisted story Uncle Richard has fabricated. I shared my plan to buy the mansion through Eleanor's legacy trust before Richard could sell it to builders. Jessica held my hand tightly, saying, "She would be so proud of you. I'll be right with you tomorrow." After she left, I chose my outfit for the final showdown, a simple yet impeccably tailored charcoal suit I had bought in a New York boutique the previous year and reserved for a meaningful moment. It was neither flashy nor branded, but exuded quiet elegance, reflecting my genuine principles instead of our family's fixation on overt status. I also picked out Grandma's modest pearl necklace, the only piece of family jewelry I inherited, and a perfect emblem of her belief in subtle grace. As I got ready to sleep, a calmness washed over me. Tomorrow would change everything, but I felt prepared. The frightened, uncertain orphan who once accepted their disdain was gone. In her place stood a woman who had created something meaningful by embracing the authentic Bennett principles, not about flaunting wealth, but about building it wisely and using it with intention. Whatever tomorrow brings, I will face it knowing the one who truly grasped what the Bennett legacy means will be with me in spirit. Watch me tomorrow, Grandma, I whispered. I whispered to the moonlit room. I believe you will be proud. Tuesday morning dawned with a crystal clear sky that seemed perfect for the day of judgment. I dressed carefully in my custom charcoal suit, fastening grandmother's pearl necklace and adding pearl earrings that once belonged to my mother. Looking into the mirror, I no longer saw the overlooked relative my family had dismissed for so long. Instead, I saw a woman filled with determination and strength for the very first time. I applied a hint of red lipstick, not to win them over, but as a symbol of readiness for the challenge ahead. I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early, placing my leather portfolio exactly at my usual spot before stepping into the hallway to find my focus. When I returned right at 9 o'clock, the family was assembled in their usual order. Uncle Richard at the head of the table, surrounded by his closest followers, with those of lesser rank arranged according to their perceived status. Jessica caught my eye and gave a slight nod of support. Good, everyone's here, Richard began without acknowledging my presence. Today, we will finalize the mansion sale and address the apartment complex issue. He signaled his assistant to hand out folders containing what looked like developer contracts. The Westbrook Development Group has offered $48 million for the estate, with construction set to commence soon. For nearly a month, their legal team has been preparing the initial contracts for all shareholders to sign today as folders made their rounds around the table. I stayed perfectly still, observing the family's animated whispers as they examined the impressive sums they stood to gain given the current ownership distribution. Uncle Richard was set to receive almost $18 million from the sale, while my 2% stake would bring in under $1 million. Still, it was a significant amount, although just a fraction compared to what the others would get. Now Richard went on to discuss the apartment complex situation. Jenkins had uncovered some possible leverage points involving the enigmatic owner. A letter had been drafted by the family's lawyer hinting at possible code compliance inspections unless the owner agreed to negotiate a fair proposal. The casual way he mentioned what was essentially legal intimidation made my blood boil, yet I kept my expression calm. Before we proceed with either of these matters, I said, my voice firmer and more confident than ever in a family gathering, I would like to take the floor briefly to present something myself. Richard glanced at his watch with irritation. We have a tight agenda today, Emily. The developers expect our signed contracts by noon. This will not take long, I answered as I stood and moved to the front of the room without waiting for approval. The unusual boldness of my action caught their attention immediately. My movement prompted several cousins to exchange surprised glances. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a single document, the latest appraisal of my entire assets. For years, I have listened to speculations about my financial status. I started making eye contact with each relative one by one. I have heard whispers about the poor family member and tolerated the disdain, the sympathy, and at times the overt ridicule. Brandon shifted uneasily in his chair, while Vanessa suddenly showed great interest in her manicure. Yesterday, Uncle Richard showed a chart illustrating the contribution of every family member to our shared fortune. I thought it was time to refresh that information. I handed the valuation report to Richard's assistant, asking her to project it on the screen. As the document appeared, revealing my net worth of $73 million, a stunned silence took hold of the room. This cannot be right, Brandon finally stammered, his face turning red. There must be some error. I smiled calmly. No error. While you have been purchasing sports cars and vacation homes, I have been assembling a real estate portfolio that surpasses most of yours combined. I then began handing out copies of my full financial report, delighting in the shocked looks as family members flipped through pages outlining my vast holdings. But you live in that modest apartment, Aunt Catherine protested faintly. You drive that old Toyota. I answered, by choice, not necessity. Grandma always said that showcasing wealth and creating wealth often conflict with each other. I decided to prioritize the latter. Uncle Richard had developed a peculiar shade of gray as he examined my financial papers. How did you manage this without any family ties, without our network? The genuine surprise in his tone nearly made me chuckle. I explained that I followed Grandma's lessons on patient investing and spotting undervalued properties that have the potential to grow. These are the same strategies our family seems to have set aside, opting instead for flashy projects and acquisitions aimed at status. I pulled out another document from my portfolio, the one proving my ownership of the luxury apartment complex, about the mysterious owner you intended to intimidate and annoy, I said, placing the paper right in front of Vanessa. I believe you are all my tenants. Instantly, the room exploded into confusion. Blake knocked over his water glass. Brandon started babbling incoherent denials, and Vanessa stared at the document as if it could harm her. Uncle Richard tried to seize control again, his voice sharper than I had ever heard it. This is impossible. You could not have bought that building. The purchase price was well over $20 million. I smiled, savoring his unease. $28 million, in fact, all legally and ethically obtained through careful investment growth over a decade. Then I turned to face my cousins directly. So when you raised concerns about construction noise during breakfast, Vanessa, you were actually upset about the security enhancements I implemented after the break-in on the 12th floor. And Blake, the guest registration rule you found unnecessary was introduced following 3 separate cases of unauthorized individuals gaining access to the gym and pool areas. Their surprised reactions would have been amusing if the situation were different. Uncle Richard was swiftly scanning my financial reports. His forehead creased. Even if all this is accurate, it does not alter the family voting system regarding the sale of the mansion. The agreements have been drafted based on the predetermined shareholding ratios. This was the moment I had been bracing for. I set down one last paper on the table, the incorporation documents for Eleanor's Legacy Trust. Actually, there has been a recent modification in the ownership arrangement. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I have transferred all my shares to Eleanor's Legacy Trust, which simultaneously acquired Jenkins Development Company. I paused to let the consequences settle. Jenkins Development Company, as you might remember, holds 30% of Bennett Family Holdings, accumulated gradually through various proxy acquisitions. Richard's face turned completely pale as he finally grasped the full scale of what had transpired. "That cannot be," he murmured. "Would we have known?" I asked softly. "You were all so certain of my—" A financial insignificance so complete that no one had paid attention to what I was actually doing all these years, I addressed the entire family, speaking with a calm authority that even silenced Brandon's stammering. With my recently consolidated voting shares, I now hold 35% of Bennett Family Holdings. Not quite a majority, but enough to block any significant decision, including the sale of this mansion. The silence that followed was profound. Even Richard, who usually remains composed, looked at a loss for words. At last, Jessica broke the tension with a slow, admiring applause. "Well done, cousin. Grandma would be proud." Brandon, unwilling to accept defeat gracefully, pushed back from the table. "This is some kind of trick. You cannot just come in and seize control after contributing nothing to the family business for years." I fixed him with an unwavering gaze. "I have not taken control, Brandon. I have prevented the destruction of Grandma's legacy by those who have forgotten its true meaning." I gathered my documents and returned to my seat, allowing them to absorb the monumental change that had just occurred. "The mansion sale is off the table," I declared flatly. "Regarding the apartment complex, rest assured, I have no intention of evicting family members. However, I will be reviewing the substantial rent discounts some of you have been receiving compared to other tenants." Vanessa's face reddened with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Uncle Richard, always the strategist, was already adjusting his expression. The mood shifted rapidly from shock to a thoughtful evaluation of how to navigate this unfamiliar situation. "Maybe we should consider a more cooperative strategy regarding our family assets moving forward," he proposed, his tone noticeably more respectful than it had been only moments earlier. I responded with agreement, suggesting we begin by revisiting Grandma's initial vision for our family's legacy, one rooted in careful guardianship rather than prideful display, focused on growing wealth with intention instead of flaunting it. As I observed their astonished expressions, I felt not victory, but a quiet sense of fulfillment, realizing that at last, after so long, they were truly recognizing me for who I am. In the days that followed my revelation, the Bennett family's interactions experienced a profound and unforeseen transformation. The immediate scene in the conference room was a mixture of confusion and frantic adjustment. Uncle Richard tried to maintain his influence. Brandon wavered between disbelief and awkward efforts to redefine our connection, and Vanessa suddenly developed a newfound admiration for my business insight, which had apparently been hidden from her for many years. This evolution was both captivating and obvious. Richard was the first to adapt, inviting me to a private luncheon the very next day at his exclusive club, a place he had never before proposed I accompany him. "I have clearly underestimated you," he confessed, examining me with fresh perspective across the elegant table setting. "Perhaps we have all been blinded by long-standing traditions." I took a sip of water, neither fully accepting nor rejecting his gesture of reconciliation. "Grandma used to say we often mistake the true essence of wealth for its mere symbols." He nodded, reflecting seriously. Eleanor always saw things differently from most of the family. I understand now she passed that mindset on to you. His effort to mend fences was expected, yet came loaded with conditions, proposals to unite our strengths and amplify our shared influence. This showed he still failed to understand the core differences in our principles. I listened with patience but refrained from any promises, making clear that any future cooperation must be grounded in the values of responsible stewardship Grandma had always advocated. Aunt Catherine tried another tactic, inviting me out for tea at her country club and suddenly showing an interest in the charitable work I do. After years of belittling my efforts as insignificant, the strain of pretending she had never looked down on me was evident in the tightness of her smile. Family matters a lot, don't you think? Despite our little disagreements over the years, she offered, touching my hand in a manner meant to feel nurturing. That gesture would have been heartwarming if it had not been so calculated. Brandon hesitated longer to reach out. His pride was clearly bruised by the realization that his supposedly struggling cousin was actually far wealthier than he was. When he contacted me with a business proposition regarding a development project, claiming that my unique insight was essential. Although it was clear his main interest was gaining access to my funds, I declined politely but firmly. I suggested he reconsider some of Grandma's investment principles if he wished to discuss potential future partnerships. Not everyone reacted out of self-interest. Jessica, who had supported me throughout the revelation, remained a loyal ally during the subsequent family reshuffling. She joked over coffee a week after the confrontation, comparing the situation to a nature documentary, saying, "Watch as the Bennett family members adjust to the new apex predator in their usual environment." We shared a laugh, enjoying the sincere warmth of our bond, which sharply contrasted with the sudden attentiveness from relatives who had previously ignored me. I deliberately chose carefully which relationships to cultivate and which to keep at a polite distance. Those who showed authentic regret for their past behavior were given second chances, while those who only changed their attitudes superficially received professional courtesy and little beyond that. Grandma's mansion became my first significant endeavor. Instead of selling it to developers as Richard intended, I transformed it into the headquarters for the newly established Eleanor Bennett Foundation, focusing on affordable housing projects and financial support. Education for marginalized communities carried an ironic twist that I could not ignore. The very relatives who once scoffed at my supposed lack of financial resources were now present at foundation gatherings held in a mansion preserved by the wealth they never realized I had. I chose to keep my humble apartment and dependable Toyota, not because I had to, but because I valued the freedom that came with living without others' expectations. Even after my financial situation became clear, my cousins occasionally showed confusion over my preference for authenticity rather than extravagance, but they no longer mistook this for incapacity. The deepest impact of my revelation arrived half a year later when Martha, our family's longtime housekeeper, reached out to me at a foundation event in the mansion. She said, "Your grandmother visits me sometimes in my dreams," her aged hand resting gently on mine. Last night she was shining with pride. Martha revealed that she always understood what others overlooked, that true wealth is meant to provide security for doing good deeds, not for flaunting possessions. Tears welled up as she added, "Miss Eleanor always said you were the one who genuinely inherited the Bennett spirit, not the name or the fortune, but its very heart." This acknowledgement carried far more meaning than all the newfound family respect I had earned after years of dismissal. My path to healing was underway. The immediate pain caused by many years of patronizing attitudes and exclusion could not vanish with just one victorious moment. Family gatherings still held the risk of old habits trying to take control again. There were times when an unintended remark from Brandon or Vanessa would bring back past hurts. However, as months passed, I became more at ease in my new position as the keeper of Grandma's genuine legacy, learning to strike a balance between forgiving and setting firm but healthy limits. The most important insight I gained during this journey was not related to money at all. For a long time, I allowed my family to misunderstand me, partly as a tactic, but also because I still craved their acceptance. The liberation that came with finally being truly recognized, regardless of whether they approved, was worth more than any real estate I owned. I realized that success without honesty feels empty, that wealth without meaning turns into a weight, and that family ties without authentic respect are not worth holding on to. Now, sitting in Grandma's rose garden, preserved forever thanks to the foundation, I experience a deep calm beyond the satisfaction of that striking discovery day. The Bennett family keeps changing. Some connections are healing into something real, while others keep a respectful gap. The mansion, once nearly converted into apartments, now serves as a place for teaching financial skills to young people from backgrounds like mine. My mother is a kindergarten teacher who married into wealth, but never lost sight of the importance of hard work and integrity. I still drive my Toyota to foundation meetings where Uncle Richard arrives in his Bentley, yet the difference now is that we both recognize it is my decision rather than my limitation. The real wealth I have created goes beyond my real estate investments. It lies in the freedom to live truthfully, regardless of what others might think, to uphold values that have meaning beyond status and appearance, and to use privilege as a way to create positive change instead of self promotion. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated by family or friends only to prove them wrong later on? Or perhaps you are still in that phase of growth where those around you cannot yet see your true potential. I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story of quiet perseverance and eventual triumph touched a chord with you, please press the like button and subscribe to hear more tales about discovering strength and authenticity, even when others fail to recognize your worth. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And remember, sometimes the most powerful action is not flaunting your advantages, but patiently waiting for the right moment to unveil them.